All right, well, just a quick review for those that maybe were not here last week. We found out that Elijah was a nobody from nowhere, that we meet him in 1 Kings 17, and it just says Elijah from Tishbe of wherever. But it doesn't give any ancestry for him. So he really was somebody that didn't have a family name. He was the first one in his family that was a prophet. So we don't know much about him. Really just kind of came out of nowhere. And then we used rocks, if you remember, to represent the incredible things that God did in and through Elijah's life. And we said that those rocks then are put together to be an altar of remembrance, that in our own lives, so many times we focus on the negative. We focus on the hardships of our life. It really is important. It's actually honoring to the Lord when we take those rocks, we look back and we say, this is where the Lord answered prayer. This was a miracle that happened. And we honor him by building an altar of remembrance. And that's what Elijah did. In Elijah's life, we talked about where he had great confidence. We talked about the trust that he had, courageous faith, and how he saw the power of God. And so we took those into our own lives and thought about, okay, let's reflect upon where God has shown us great confidence, where we've had trust, where we've seen the power of God. Now, you would have thought after this incredible victory that Elijah had on Mount Carmel, where it was the 450 prophets of Baal that danced and tried to get their God to come down and burn up the sacrifice, and it didn't happen. But then Elijah came in and he rebuilt the altar, and then he just said, Lord, do your thing. And the sacrifice was just burned up just like that. You would think that there would be so much spiritual momentum that Elijah had, that he would just be on this spiritual high, like, yes, something amazing just happened. All right, let's take on the next battle. Totally opposite. Instead of going this way, it was like he took a huge downward turn. And, think about us now. Remember, we're always making that connection. How does this relate to me? How does it relate to us? I can identify with that in my own life, that when I've put out a lot of energy, when there's been a spiritual battle that I've been in, and maybe there's been a great victory or things that are going well in my life, then it seems like I'm the most vulnerable, and that things happen that just are such a letdown and hit me harder than maybe they would at any other time. And it seems, too, that when we've hit a milestone in our life, that it brings that life change or transition we talked about before, that, you're excited about graduating from high school, and then the day after graduating from high school, you just realize you're unemployed. Or you're so excited because you're having a baby, and then you have your baby and you're like, what do I do with it? So there can be those times where you're all set up for these great things that happens, and then, whoa, what now? There can be a vulnerability, a letdown that happens. And I believe that Elijah is a model for us today as we look at how that happened in his life. And not only on an individual basis, but I believe that can happen corporately. We talked about as a church that we've had some great milestones, some wonderful things that have happened, and yet we can be in that kind of time where, okay, we're entering a new season. Will it be a time of letdown? Will it be, how are we going to navigate these times ahead? So that's the perspective we're looking at. So we're going to pick it up, this story, in 1 Kings 18, 45. Actually 44. And Elijah tells Ahab's servant, this is 1 Kings 18:44, go and tell Ahab, he was the king, hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you. Meanwhile, the sky grew black with clouds, the winds rose, a heavy rain started falling, and Ahab rode off to Jezreel. The power of the Lord came on Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. Now, the rain starting in itself is a miracle because there had been a drought for many years. So you had the rain starting. Elijah says, Ahab, you better get going because you're going to get rained out if you don't go. And Elijah then, pick this up here, Elijah ran, but Ahab was in a chariot. And Elijah got to Jezreel before Ahab did. That's pretty crazy. I mean, that he was able to run that fast and he got to Jezreel. And it kind of reminds me of Forrest Gump. You know how anybody see that movie and he's running? Life is like a box of chocolates, all that kind of stuff. So my question would be, because we want to follow the questions, is why was Elijah so anxious to get to Jezreel? One might be because he wanted to make sure that those in Jezreel got the story right, because that was pretty phenomenal what he had just done, what God had just done on Mount Carmel. And he wanted to make sure the story got right. There's also a part of me that thinks maybe there was an expectation that Elijah had. Like he had just had this great victory. Now he was going to go back, and maybe they were going to throw a party for him. Maybe there was going to be a parade. Like, yeah, Elijah, what an incredible prophet that you are. And I believe that's part of the setup. Don't we do that sometimes? Like something great happens, and even if we don't say it, there's something in us that's this expectation of, well, now, like, people are going to really notice. Like, there's that affirmation that we're looking for. And I think that was part of it with Elijah. Like, wow, I really showed them that God works through me. Totally not happening. Actually, it was the opposite of what happened. Because the most vulnerable time is when we have experienced the victory. And watch what happens. Chapter 19, verse 1. Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done. Jezebel was his wife. She was the queen. And how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. Basically, Jezebel just put a death threat on Elijah's life. She said, if I don't have you killed by tomorrow, then may I be the one that dies. Because she was so ticked off that her God, Baal, was just made fun of. He was mocked. And that God, our God, the one true God, was the one who had triumphed that day. So Elijah did not get the positive recognition at all. And we're not going to go too far into it today, but there really is even operating today what we call a Jezebel spirit. And a Jezebel spirit is one of those that is very controlling, that it will do, there's an obsessive passion or a single-minded just determination to bring people down, to belittle people. And, you know, it's a very evil spirit that operates within people. Remember, we don't fight against flesh and blood. We're not targeting it as people, but it's a spirit that comes. And that's what was operating against Elijah and could also be operating against us when we have these great victories. That we talked about it a few weeks ago, that people aren't always going to be happy for you. When good things happen to you, don't set yourself up that, oh man, this is going to be the best now. Now everybody's going to like really know that I'm on track or that God's doing this, because a lot of times it's not going to happen. So being aware of the enemy's tactic of not having that expectation that everything and everybody's going to be all happy for what he's doing in your life. So now, how does Elijah handle the threat? Let's move on. 1 Kings 19:3. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. Isn't that crazy? He had just done this miraculous thing on Mount Carmel. Is God's miraculous power, an expression of that, was worked through Elijah. And a woman says to him, you know what, I'm going to have you killed. Gives that threat. Now, I can say this because I'm a woman, all right? Like, that's not a big deal. Like, he should not have been scared by a woman. Now, most guys won't be able to say that because I think there might be guys that are afraid of women. But as a woman, I can say, hey, wow, that was like an empty threat. How could he be so like wigged out by that? Why would that upset him? Why would that make him afraid? But I think it's because he was discouraged by fear. Not only was he depleted, he was wore out emotionally, spiritually, physically, but now he became discouraged by fear. What a contrast. Big man of faith, now fear. Fear had replaced his faith. In a quick moment, all of that confidence, trust, courageous faith, power of God, it was like it was gone. And why? Because Elijah's focus shifted from God to the problem. As long as he was focused on God and what God was going to do, then amazing things happen. As soon as his focus shifted to his problem, this threat from this woman, Jezebel, then he just got afraid. It completely messed with his mind, as we would say. And he retreated. I think about that with 1 Peter 5:8. I love that verse. It says, "Be self-controlled and alert. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour." Kind of reminds me of Jezebel, like this roaring lion. But, I did a little research on that, and do you know that the lions that roar the loudest are the oldest lions that may not even have teeth? Isn't that crazy? So what they're doing is they're trying to intimidate. So they do this big roar, and then that makes the prey fearful, and then the prey usually end up running into, the herd or whatever they call, pack of other lions that would devour them. But all it is it's a roar, and that's what Jezebel was doing. It was just empty words, empty threats. But how many times do we get discouraged by those kind of things? We forget that there's an end to the story, that at the end of the story, God defeats Satan. He's already defeated. We're just walking out the process, all right? So when those empty threats come, we can stand against it. So my question to you this morning, to make it personal, is what is it for you that can discourage you so easily? Is it maybe a negative comment that someone says, and maybe they didn't even mean it negative. You just heard it in a negative way. Maybe it's a failure. Maybe you tried to do something and it didn't work out, and now the enemy is using that in your head, that it discounts every other victory that you had because of this one area that maybe you didn't measure up in. Remember, it's all tactics of the enemy. It's all mind games that the enemy wants to do for you, against you. Or maybe it was some rejection that you encountered. I think about that with young people that, they have a lot of friends, and maybe this one time they were left out of something, and now that takes prime importance over all the good times that they had with their friends. Whenever I encounter things, this verse comes to my head a lot, John 16:33, and it says, "In this life you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart because I have overcome the world." Isn't that a great verse? And it isn't like if you have trials and sorrows, it says when. Expect to have trials and sorrows, but I have overcome the world. You don't need to be discouraged by fear. But what does Elijah do? Unfortunately, Elijah plays right into the enemy's hands. And he's discouraged by fear, but then he's disabled by isolation. What does Elijah do then? He ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. Disabled by isolation. Remember, by this time, Elijah's tired, he's weary, he's exhausted, he's anxious because people are after him, they're chasing him, so he's hiding. But what he does, it looks small here, but it's huge. When he got to Beersheba, he left his servant, the guy who had been with him through all this time. He left him. He said, "Okay, you stay here. I'm going another day into the wilderness." How often do we do that? That when those trials, and as John says, those sorrows come, that instead of leaning in to the people that have been that support for us, we suddenly start to isolate ourselves. We pull ourselves away from the ones who can provide the support that we need. And that's exactly what Elijah did in this exhausted, kind of depressed state that he was in at that. And you know what happens when we isolate like that? Because I can be prone to that as well. What happens is there's no one there to speak truth and life into our situation. So all that's happening is the negativity that we're in at the moment because we're not getting that outside perspective. And you can isolate yourself physically, as in not answering your phone, returning texts, not answering your door. But I think many of us isolate ourselves in an emotional way. How are you doing? Good. How's things going? Great. And on the inside, it's an isolation. Like, I don't want you to know what's really happening inside of me. And that, again, that's an enemy's tactic that he uses. And I thought about this week, and this is in no way, again, I told you, I'm not a salesman at all. But I do like to promote things that are positive. And this week I was able to go to 3 different small groups, and that was amazing. The one I went to last Sunday night was Dave and Gina Janik's group. And it was so cool because there must have been 25 people that were there. Half of them were adults, half of them were kids. And during that time, it wasn't even that it got real deep spiritually. They played games together. And it was so cool to see kids from one family being teamed with adults from another family. So there was that intermingling of the families. There was so much laughter there that night, so much fun. I could tell that the relationships had grown because they were asking one of the girls about this award that she had won. And it was just great to see that as they were together. Another thing that blessed me so much was one of the single moms in the group is looking for a job, and one of the other guys was helping her, had made a contact for her and said, hey, I made that contact for you. And I just thought, wow, how cool is that because of their relationship, because they were together, they were able to be that support for one another. And sometimes, I think laughter is extremely spiritual. I think having fun is very important to do because it builds that relationship. And then I was at the women's small group on Thursday nights that's held here. And just to be part of that group and to see the women open up to each other and to share things that were deeper than surface level. And for the rest of the group, just to encourage one another. And this one had some insight here, and this one had this. And so I just want to encourage you that when the enemy tells you, you know what, your problems are too big, what you're going through, nobody will understand. It's not true. People have been there before. They can help you. They will help you. So don't isolate yourself. That's what I love about family fellowship, is when you come here, please know that we look at you as family. We care for each other, and there's different avenues to do that, whether it be a small group or call the church office. Love to pray with you, meet with you, help you in any way that we can, because I hate the term, I'm going to church. Because really what's happening is the church, all of you, is coming to worship together on Sunday. Do you see the difference there? When you say I'm going to church, you're talking about going to a building. When you talk about the church coming together, you're talking about the relational part of it. You're talking about engaging together in worship. And that's what I love about us today, that the church has come together for that encouragement. So Elijah wasn't there, though. Elijah's like sleeping now under a broom tree, whatever a broom tree is. I'm not sure what a broom tree is. But let's continue on. The rest of 1 Kings 4b. Okay, so he came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the bush, and he fell asleep. How sad that essentially Elijah was suicidal. He was saying, take my life. There's nothing left. I can't do this anymore. And I don't know if any of you have gotten to that level. I'm sure some have. But I think it's pretty cool that God put that in the Bible to let you know that here's a prophet that did amazing things. And he ended up getting to the point where he said, Lord, I want to die. I can't take this anymore. And, I think part of that is because of the progression that had happened. That it started out that he was vulnerable. He was hungry. He was tired. He was angry that his expectations weren't met. So he was vulnerable. The next part was he let fear consume him. So he's tired and he's fearful. And then he isolated himself, which then led him to be devastated by self-pity. Now, I don't think anybody in this room can criticize Elijah for that, because we all can be prone to that, can't you? I know I can. That, man, I can get into that self-pity box really quickly. Like, I'm on my own, nobody cares, what about me? And that's where Elijah found himself that day. And all because of that progression that had started, that he wasn't getting the help that he needed. And I love this quote by Chuck Swindoll. It says, self-pity mauls its way into our minds like a beast and claws us to shreds. I completely believe that, because it can be tough when you get into that mindset of poor me, that victim mentality. It's very difficult to get yourself out of that, and that's where we need the Lord to help us. And that's what Elijah needed as well. And I believe this is where we start to think about now moving forward in what God has for you, because God has an incredible future, a plan and a future for your life individually, and then also as a church body. As we're moving forward into a new season, there may be parts along the way. You've heard me talk about we're vulnerable during this time. And yet, how do we now move into and get ready for a new season with a new pastor, new vision, what God's calling us to for this community and the world? And maybe, you're not at the fearful, gone to those stages in your life, or even thinking about us as a family here, but there's different stages that we're in that I believe the Lord shows great just ideas on how he wants to help us and minister to us through that. So let's look at how God prepared Elijah for a new season. The first thing is rest. Number one is rest. Because it said that, let me find it here. He lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there was by his head some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. Sometimes we get this image of God that he's up there and that he's always disappointed in us, that we never quite reach that level that he wants us to. So he's probably standing up there just kind of looking down like, well, they messed up again. There they are, all self-pity, feeling sorry for themselves again. But that's not how God is at all. Do you notice that God doesn't even address that with him at all? He lets him rest. And I believe that sometimes the most spiritual thing that you can do is take a nap. Can I get an amen on that? Amen. That when you get to that point when you're wore out, take a rest. It's okay. Can I tell you, type A personalities, those people that feel like they're not worthy unless they're always doing, God took a rest. If God can rest, you can rest, okay? Because there's even a sense where it can be a sense of pride, like the world will not go on if I don't continue doing this. Well, you know what? God rested, the world went on, all right? So you just got to be careful with that thinking. But it's okay to rest. Let others take care of you for once. Moms out there and dads, like you can help the moms so this can happen. Take some rest, all right? See how the Lord will provide in those ways. That's all about what taking a Sabbath is all about. And then if you look at David, I love in Psalm 62, he talks about rest a lot, and yet he was a king of a country. He had a crazy family. He did some things he shouldn't have done. He was a leader in battle, and yet when he was in those most conflicted times, he says, "Truly my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from him." And then verse 5, "Yes, my soul, find rest in God. My hope comes from him." I thought that was so good coming from David. And then here's where the Lord does intervene. In verse 9, I believe it is. Well, in verse 8 it says that he got up and drank. He left where he was under the tree after the angel had ministered to him. So verse 8 says, he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by the food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. Then he went into the cave and spent the night. And the word of the Lord came to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Tone is important. It wasn't, what are you doing here, Elijah? It was, what are you doing here, Elijah? Now, it's important to reflect on where he is. He ran a long way, if you looked at the map, a long way down to the mountain. And that mountain was where Moses received the 10 Commandments. Right? Also, Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb. And so he went to a sacred place. So Elijah went to a sacred place, and he went inside of the cave. And God says to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And when God asks that, and when he asks us those kinds of questions, it's not because God needs to know the answer. He knows everything. The reason is because we need to give an answer. We need to process that. We need to do some soul searching to say, yeah, what am I doing here? That answer that Elijah gives, that we're going to read, says a lot about his emotional and spiritual state. Because what he was doing is God was saying, you know what? It's time for Elijah to rediscover me, to rediscover God in a new way. So he says, what are you doing here? And this is how Elijah answers. I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. Man, how much more whiny can you get? Right? But God didn't even approach that. He didn't even call him out on it. This is what God did. And yesterday, as I was doing my final preparations, this does not happen to me very often in my preparation time, but I had this weighty moment. And in that weighty moment, it was one of those whoa, what's God saying here? And is this just for me? Is it for our church? What is it that he's saying? And I felt like how God responds here is something that's really important for us. So let's read what happens. And it says, the Lord said, go and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. I think what was so interesting about this is that Elijah was used to the fireworks, what we would call the smoke and lights, so to speak. Imagine, he had just had this incredible experience on Mount Carmel where God came down, blew up the altar, did the sacrifice, did all those things. And so what he was used to, how Elijah was used to the Lord showing himself and showing his presence, was in a very spectacular way. And this was the word that I felt like the Lord gave to me and to us, for us today. In our search for the spectacular, sometimes we miss the significant. In the search for the spectacular, sometimes we miss the significant. And let me expand that a little bit for us, because I think there can be a tendency to think, if God moved this way before, then that's how I know how he's moving in the future. Okay? And I can reflect on that, all the camps that I've gone to in my time as a child, different services that I've been in. You see God work in different ways, or even personally in my life. And there can be a tendency to go back to that and think, well, that's how I know God's working. And I believe as God's preparing us for this new season, what he's saying is, are you open to it may not being the spectacular in whatever you think is spectacular? That has a lot of definitions. But are you open to the significant? And what if that significant, and this is, I think is so cool, is that it's a gentle whisper? What if it was one word that God gave to you? And I thought back upon the first Sunday that I was here in January, and I felt so strongly to talk about everyone having my one word. Because if you remember what I said from John 16, it says, my sheep hear my voice, I know them, and they follow me. That every one of you that calls Jesus your Savior, you hear his voice. He's constantly speaking to you. Okay? The problem is we're not always quick to listen. And then we're even slower to follow what it is that he's saying. And I love this that I read in my study. It said, a rock-shattering wind smote the mountain around Elijah with rocks breaking in pieces. Surely such a spectacular event such as this would announce the presence of the Lord and illustrate how he would work in the future. But no, the Lord was not in the wind. A dreadful earthquake occurred, shaking even the foundations under his feet. But again, the Lord was not in the earthquake. A sudden fire followed, but this too did not announce the presence nor the activity of the Lord. Still, the Lord was not there. All of these physical phenomena had known to be precursors of God's coming or presence. You know, it happened when he gave the 10 Commandments. All these things that Elijah would have been aware of. It happened with David and the things that he had done. So I believe that this verse, Psalm 46:10, is really important to us as we move forward. That be still and know that I am God. It's growing in the ability to hear God's voice. Of first of all, believing that God speaks to you, and then the second half of it is doing what it is that he's called you to do. Because there can be, you know, I would not say this about our church, but I've seen other churches where there's been a very charismatic leader that everybody relied on that leader, and when the leaders left, many times the church doesn't know what to do. Now, and I'm not saying that was I think we were been set up very, very well. But I also believe that there can be a tendency in us to look to others instead of believing that God really does speak to us and wants to use us in the circles that we are in. And I want to end this morning with just an example in my life where I felt like I almost blew it. I had another example that wasn't so good where I did not follow through. But yesterday, this was really heavy on my heart, and there was a funeral viewing that I was made aware of, and there was a connection, you know, that made it very, you know, just logical for me to go and just support the family. But I didn't know them real well. So there was kind of an awkwardness that I felt like, well, they wouldn't even know if I was there or wasn't there, and I don't know. But this is how the Lord speaks to me. A thought comes in my head that normally I wouldn't have on my own, and then it doesn't leave. You ever had that? Like it just kind of starts in your head, then it's in your heart, and I kept thinking like, wow, I should go. I should do that. But I don't know. I don't know them that well. I don't know what I would say. I'm not good in those situations. And so finally yesterday morning, it was like, you know what? I need to do this. And so what's incredible is there were a couple guys from the church that were going, and so I called one of them. I said, hey, can I go with you? And he said, yeah, definitely. And I went and had this great interaction with the family that was there. And, you know, when I left, I felt like the Lord said, you know, kind of thumbs up, way to follow through. But it started with the still small voice. It started with a gentle whisper. And I share that story with you today because I believe that the Lord is doing that gentle whisper to you as well. In your family, in your work environment, even personally. Are there things that you just can't get it off your mind? You can't get it off your heart. The Lord's saying, don't look for some spectacular answer. Don't look to somebody else to give you the answer. He's saying, I'm telling you, just listen and follow through.